I've been thinking all week about what to preach on this text and what to do for today's sermon. And I'm over halfway through my internship, so I want to try doing something a little more creative. I've been taught that one way to make a text come alive is to act it out. So I thought about doing that with today's reading. And then I realized that would involve flipping over the altar and chasing you all out of here with a whip. I would also like to pass internship, and I would hate to scare everyone away when Pastor Dwayne's not here, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try a different approach. Because I do want us to get a sense of how shocking what Jesus did must have been. So think about how someone who's in the temple on that day might have reacted. Did you hear what Jesus did? He came in here into the temple, and he lost it. I mean, he disrupted everything. This is the Jerusalem temple. This is where God lives. And Jesus came in here and made a scene. I mean, if some itinerant street preacher wants to complain about the temple, well, he'd hardly be the first. But to come and do it in the temple right before Passover? I mean, okay. Maybe the money changers and the selling stuff has gotten a little bit out of hand recently. But really, what kind of religion doesn't have some commercialization in it? I mean, I've even heard that some of Jesus' own followers are going to start selling these bracelets that say WWJD, or what would Jesus do? And maybe yesterday I would have thought that was a good, clever question, but what would Jesus do? I'll tell you what he'd do. He'd come in here and flip over tables and disrupt worship. And over what? I mean, over a few merchants setting up tables in the courtyard? It's Passover. There are 300,000 extra people in town here in Jerusalem for the weekend. I mean, shouldn't the city get some kind of economic benefit for our inconvenience? And the sellers they're serving an important purpose. I mean, the law of Moses requires that people coming to the temple to sacrifice bring a sheep or cattle or something, but it needs to be perfect. Have you ever tried to travel 100 miles with a sheep and keep it clean and pure and perfect? And there are people who can't even afford a sheep. So they bring their savings, maybe a few pennies, and they can buy a dove to sacrifice. Except wait, Jesus threw out the dove sellers. And the money changers. Okay, maybe it does seem a little odd to have basically a bank in the middle of your church, in the temple, but it serves an important purpose. I mean, with the Roman occupation, we all have this Roman currency, and it has the picture of the emperor on it, the image of Caesar. And we know the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make images of idols and worship them. With Caesar claiming to be a god, we couldn't possibly use that coin to pay the temple tax. So we need these money changers at the temple to change these Roman denarii to Jewish shekels. Makes sense. They're serving a good purpose. Maybe if you understood some of the history. After rescuing us from slavery and bringing us out of Egypt into the Promised Land, the historical event we're celebrating here during Passover time, God gave us the gift of the law. I know what you're thinking, since when is law a gift? But think about the 10 Commandments, a little different than that Roman law. Do you know how they start? The first commandment, is to have no other gods before the Lord. But even before that, it starts with God speaking, and I quote, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." And why would we want to? I mean, look what God has done for us. This starts with God's action. Look what God has done for our people. God has every right to set some rules for us. And these 10 commandments and the rest of the laws from the prophets and the Torah and the rabbis, they allow us to live in peace with each other. They're good rules to have, good instructions. And that law starts with what God's done for us, with God's action. It's a law of grace, really. And when we disobey, I mean, it happens. There's 613 commandments, the rabbis say. So when we break them, God graciously gives us a way to return through coming here to the temple to sacrifice. God promises to accept our sacrifice. And that brings us back to the temple, to what Jesus did. And right before Passover, no less. During the very time when we hear about God rescuing God's people, Jesus goes into the temple and disrupts everything. I mean, I figure he probably made such a scene, he disrupted the whole sacrifice system for half an hour or so. But why? Maybe he was upset about some people who got a little blinded by prophets and they were preying on innocent travelers. I don't know, maybe he was just having a bad day. But I think about it more. I think that maybe Jesus was saying something about this entire system, challenging it. Challenging the entire way that we understand God to be working. I mean, did you hear what he said when some of the leaders challenged him? They asked why he was doing this, what sign he could show them to interfere, what right he had to interfere with how people and God interacted. But he didn't really answer. Instead, he said this cryptic statement about if you destroy the temple, he would build it up again in 3 days. That's ludicrous. And think about how long it took to build the temple. And just this remodeling project of Herod's has taken 46 years. How could it possibly be rebuilt in 3 days? I don't get it. Jesus is turning the whole world upside down, messing up the entire system, and I don't get it. Well, even though the people in the temple and the religious leaders may not have understood what was going on, what Jesus was saying, we have a little help so we can understand. The Gospel's narrator explains that Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. And he explains that after Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples looked back and remembered this, and they understood. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this story that we're reading from the Gospel of John is that John was written after the temple itself was actually destroyed by Roman invasion in the year 70. And this destruction of the temple by the Romans was devastating to the Jewish people. I mean, it shook their whole way of life, their whole understanding of the world. The temple was where God lived. That's where you go to meet God. That's God's presence on earth. So their whole world was changed, destroyed when the temple was destroyed. So for John, who's writing probably to a Jewish community of Christians after the temple's destruction, the story about Jesus in the temple is really critical to understanding what Jesus is doing, to understanding God's presence in the world after the temple's destruction. And he uses this to frame everything that he says about Jesus in the gospel. And I didn't know this until this week, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospels, the story's still there, but it comes at the end, right before Jesus is crucified, before he's arrested. And so maybe he was arrested partly because he was disturbing the peace, disturbing the temple. But John takes the story and he puts it at the beginning of his gospel. Right in chapter 2, right after Jesus turns water into wine, his first miracle. And the reason that Jesus going in the temple is so important to John is because he understands God as being present in Jesus, Jesus being the Word made flesh, God's presence in the world. So the temple is no longer needed as a place for God to live because God has come in the person of Jesus. So we can find God's presence directly. We don't need to go to a specific building where God lives. Because of the resurrection, where the temple of Jesus' body, God's presence, was actually raised in 3 days, we know that God's presence is not located in a specific place. God is not bound by a location, by walls. So we can encounter God in different aspects of our lives all over. And we can look for God at work all over the world, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Israel. And we can believe as Christians that God is at work, turning the world upside down, not always doing what we'd expect, breaking open our walls, changing our perception of what God does, but God is at work. And that can lead to some uncomfortable things. I think about last week when we heard Peter talking about how he didn't want to hear about Jesus the Messiah coming to suffer and die. And this week we hear about a side of Jesus that, if you're like me, maybe you're a little uncomfortable with. About Jesus getting angry, even violent, disrupting worship. And in a few weeks, we'll hear about the biggest scandal of all. As Paul said in our second reading, we'll hear about Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, and to you and I, when we look with the eyes of faith at what God is doing, we see Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. So we trust that God is working through us here in the church and all over the world. That we might not always see what God is doing. When God's breaking down walls, changing systems, it's not comfortable. It might make us uncomfortable. But Jesus has done what that temple pointed to, becoming the ultimate way in which God forgives us, the way in which God promises to be with us and to accept us. And in Jesus, God has come to be with us. Amen.